Hello and welcome back to another video. Today we're going to do Elden Riegn Nightreign on the proposed minimum requirement, which is the i5 10600 or the Ryzen 5 5500, 12GB of RAM, GTX 1060 3GB variant, or the Radeon RX 580 4GB variant, the X12 30GB of storage. Welcome to Response PC, I'm Dunk, let's game on. Now there's no target specified by the dev, so I expect that it's a 1080p lowest settings, starting off with the i5 10600 KF that I have. I don't have the non-KF variant, that won't make much a difference anyway. The GTX 1060 3GB variant and 16GB of RAM because 12, what the heck. We are at 1080p and obviously low settings. We get an average of 55 FPS. Right now the scene that you're viewing is in the training ground in the base before reaching starting a match. We get the GPU peg at 99% using 2.7 to 2.8 GB of VRAM out of 3. The CPU is in the mid-30s and we're using 11.1 GB of RAM. When you actually start a match, the GPU peg at 100% using all the 3 GB of VRAM available. CPU didn't change and we're using 12 GB of VRAM, so the 12 minimum is not exactly the minimum. That doesn't mean that the 12 is what the game need to function. You should go at 16 at least. And on top of that, the FPS when you are in the match is in the low 40s, where you're at a 42 FPS when you are in a match. So if the target FPS was 60, this is a fail. If the expected FPS is 30, it's a win. On the AMD side, the Ryzen 5 5500 with the RX 580, I have the 8GB variant, not the 4GB variant, and 16GB of RAM, not 12. Still in the training ground at 1080p and low settings, we get an average of 60 FPS. The cap FPS from software games is reached. GPU utilization is in the 80s, using 3.4GB of VRAM out of 8, but this is more than the 3GB of the GTX 1060, with the CPU in the mid-30s and using 8.4GB of RAM. So with the GTX 1060 3GB variant, we have a VRAM bottleneck, because with the RX 580 at 8GB of VRAM, we have an average of 60 FPS. And even in the open world, the RX 580 was finally reaching 100%, and I have sometimes a drop at 58 FPS, but most of the time I was at the maximum of 60 FPS. And the VRAM utilization went up to 5.5GB of VRAM. Verdict: the i5 10600 is a bit overkill. The Ryzen 5 5500 is a bit overkill. You can definitely go lower than that. 12GB of RAM, yeah, maybe on Nvidia side when you're limited with the VRAM. Otherwise than that, we've been using 8 on the AMD side. For the GPU, the RX 580 8GB variant should be the minimum requirement, not the 4GB variant, and the GTX 1060 3GB should be the 6GB variant, unless their target was 30 FPS, but they didn't specify it. 1080p, low settings, 30 FPS, yeah, the 3 and the 4GB variant of each card. If you were targeting 60 FPS plus, the 6GB GTX 1060 or the 8GB RX 580. Thanks to have come watching, see you in the next one, and subscribe.